Okay, let's get going here. I'll start with, and this is something that I caught on my Facebook page right before I came out here this morning, and really not the picture I wanted to see to start off a Sunday. But you got Whoopi Goldberg here saying, "It bums me out tremendously what the church has become, and if it's got me bummed, imagine what Jesus Christ must be feeling." So it's amazing to me, let me get that off of there quickly. It's amazing to me that, we're content with that, aren't we? And the church is very content with just talking about the problem. Just talking about the problem is our duty. It's our part, since only God can do anything about the condition of the so-called church. Only problem is that puts the fault where? With God, if we can't do anything. And the church is, everybody admits it, is on a fast-track crazy train, zooming down the track, and is powerless to do anything about it. And our contention is that the reason that they can't do anything about it is due to its ideology and orthodoxy, which a lot of that we're going to talk about today. Now, so getting right into our lesson, kind of keep me apprised of the time, because we've got a lot to cover today. A little bit of cleanup. We're behind. Actually, the transcript that I'm looking at was prepared for, or the notes that I'm looking at was prepared for 9:15, and this is like what, the 29th or something. So we're ahead, which is good. So chapter 111 through 212 is this historical recollection of Paul's conversion and calling to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And I want to mention today that we finally are coming into Galatians 2:20, which is the dreaded Galatians 2:20, which is one of the most twisted scriptures surely in all of the Bible, Galatians 2:20, and hopefully we're going to get into that. So Galatians 1, chapter 1:11 through 2:12 is this historical recollection of Paul's conversion and calling to be an apostle to the Gentiles. Okay? And it is also a good example of why we should read the Bible for ourselves. Okay? Paul was converted and called and then spent 3 years in the wilderness being taught by the Lord, right? How often did we hear that in church? There's even some sitting out there going, yeah. Okay.
You were even told this past week that you need to go out in the desert for 3 years.
Yeah, right. In regard to my teachings on Galatians, I needed to go out and isolate myself in the wilderness and be taught of the Spirit and come back a new man rather than the degenerate than I am. Paul was converted and called and then spent 3 years in the wilderness, and unfortunately when I typed this out this morning, only the first page is in 14 font and the rest is in 12, which does not serve my eyes very well. That's pure assumption, not about my eyes, but including the length of time. There is no biblical citation to back that up. If you read the account in Acts carefully, Nothing in there whatsoever says that Paul was in the wilderness for 3 years being taught of the Lord. That's pure assumption. All right? It makes sense that the Lord would do that, but the Bible never says that. It's an assumption. All right? Granted, Paul's whole point to this recollection is to demonstrate that his gospel was from God and not men. If you read the account in Acts 9, the only ecclesia history that there is, while indeed church history is in fact church history and not ecclesia history, you find that initially Paul was ministered to by everyday disciples. Think about this. Paul was not immediately sent to the ecclesia brain trust. Why not? Furthermore, considering the gravity of the letter Paul is sending to Galatia, where are the big bad elders? Think for a moment about the so-called biblical role of elders in the church. So I've got this meme, all right? So, I mean, in church today, I mean, we all know what I teach on that and the whole authority issue. Where are the all-important authoritative elders, right? They're written about 4 times in the whole New Testament, okay? In 2 letters to the problematic church at Corinth, think about this. The letters to Corinth and all of the stinking craziness that was going on there, totally out of control. They are not mentioned once, okay? In Paul's justification magnum opus, the book of Romans, they are not mentioned once, okay? In Paul's submission structure, this is a structure of submission of Ephesians 5 and 6, they're not in there, all right? In Peter's submission structure of 1 Peter 2 and 1 Peter 2 and 3, chapters 2 and 3, they're nowhere in there, okay? Then this whole motif that Matthew 18 is this God-appointed tool of the elders to discipline the church and keep the church in order, okay? They're not in there. They're not mentioned once, okay? But here's what they do. Wherever you see church in Matthew 18, Christ isn't really talking about church. Well, to begin with, church is not a Bible word, okay? The word church doesn't show up in the Bible till the 3rd or 4th century, okay? Church really means elders. Got that? Church doesn't really mean church there. It means elders. Boy, isn't that a stretch, right? And by the way, that is a twofold distancing from reality, because church there doesn't mean church to begin with. But then it somehow mysteriously means elder. It's ridiculous. Okay? Go ahead.
I just need some clarification. You're talking about Matthew 18,
Mm-hmm.
that the term elder is not mentioned in that passage of Scripture.
The word's not in there,
It's
right?
not
Or
in there.
any semblance.
But if the word church is there in Matthew 18,
Yeah.
to whom is that referring?
The ecclesia.
Okay, the body of believers,
The body of believers.
not the elders.
So if someone offends you, go to them alone. Okay? If they blow you off, or tell you to take a hike, or take a long walk off a short pier, hanging on your beak, alright? You go, you take a witness, a fellow believer. You mean an elder? No, a fellow believer. Okay? And then if they won't hear the two of you, and gosh, I don't want to get down a rabbit track, but think about the genius of this, okay? When you have a problem with someone and you don't go to them alone and you go to everyone else but them, what is that?
Gossip.
It's gossip, okay? So, not only that, the genius of this, you go to them alone and you find out most of the time that it was all a misunderstanding anyway. Okay? Especially if somebody, oh my goodness, if people would use this in the career that I'm in being a nurse aide. Oh my goodness. Okay? I gave up, I resigned myself a long time ago that I was not going to address what other aides said about me. I'm just not going to address it. Okay? I mean, I've been called into a DON's office and it's my understanding, blah, 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 and it's like, okay. Well, what do you say? Okay, they told you that. I won't even defend myself. Okay? Basically, you know, but long story short here, you know, if you go to them alone, you find out that it was all a misunderstanding to begin with. Then, if you bring a second person in, a lot of times that person will say, okay, what happened? What do you want to go talk to them about? Okay. And you kind of have to put your arm around them and say, you're being petty. I love you, but you're being petty. Okay? And if you don't have bigger fish to fry other than being offended by that, you're not busy enough. Okay? So you see the genius of this whole thing. So, but if everything's on the up and up, the guy, you know, it's legitimate, you worked for the guy in the ecclesia or your home group, your home fellowship, and he stiffed you and he's not going to pay you, whatever, totally legitimate. So the two of you go and that person is a witness and you can bring one or two people actually. If the person won't hear you then, who do you go to? You go to the ecclesia.
And that's
The entire group.
the assembly of believers.
Right.
Not the elders. You
Right.
don't go to the pastor, you don't go to the deacons, you don't go to the elders.
Right.
Because they're, in Matthew 18, they're not present in this process.
Right. Right. And this is a good discussion. We're down a rabbit track. We probably won't get through the lesson again. But it's a good discussion, and it needs to be talked about. All right? Well, Paul, you know, what are you going to do in a church of 5,000 people? Get up and tell everybody? Well, I don't know why not. But it does bolster the argument that churches aren't churches to begin with, and secondly, they don't need to be 2,000 to 5,000 people or even 1,000 people. There's small home groups. Now, if you got a small home group, okay, if you got a small home group that is considered to be literally family, doesn't that make perfect sense that you would go to the small group? All right. And if the person won't hear them, there's no excommunication. You're not telling them they're not saved. You're not taking their salvation away. What we've learned about in regard to family, okay, there's times when you got to separate yourself from certain family members, okay, until they wise up. And least of all, enable them to do whatever they're doing, right? Okay? So in a home fellowship setting where the mentality is that you're a literal family and you're meeting in a home from time to time, all of a sudden going to the ecclesia with this problem amongst family and everybody knows everybody, it makes perfect sense, right?
It does. Well, in Matthew 18, it says, you tell that person if he neglects to hear you and your two witnesses. Okay? You tell them, we have not resolved this issue.
Right.
And then you let them know, I am going to take it to the assembly, to the body of believers, and we're going to discuss it there.
Right.
If he refuses, it says here, if he neglects to hear what the body of believers have to say, then this is where you were talking about sometimes we have to separate ourselves from family members who are not
Right.
following the truth.
Because enablement isn't love.
Right.
And accepting them for whatever they are and what they're doing isn't love.
The
Okay.
verse is really neat because it says you treat them. You're not calling them a heathen, and you're not calling them a tax collector.
Right.
But Matthew is saying you treat them as
Like.
if they were a heathen and a tax collector. Well, in your mind, how do you treat a person who's a heathen? How do you treat the IRS knocking at your door? You want to stay away from them.
Right.
You don't fellowship with
Right.
them.
Right.
You remove yourself in love from their fellowship until they come, not you, they come to the realization of changes that need to be made, and then come back and to the assembly and rejoin the fellowship.
Right. And, you know, the way the so-called church does all of this is completely upside down. Ultimately, the elders decide
Right.
who's disfellowshipped and who's not. And a lot of times, it's kept from the congregation what's going on. Okay, so Paul's entire point with these passages is that this historical ditty he does here is to make the point that what he believed in his ministry wasn't based on the traditions of men and the authority of men, but was based on the authority of God alone, lest authority becomes truth. And clearly, authority has become truth, okay, in institutions, okay? And then people stop reading their Bibles, and these guys get away with all kinds of stuff. I mean, Jack Hyles got up in front of 6,000 people on a Sunday and said, "Now everybody close your Bibles and listen to me." And these guys get away with this stuff. Why? Because they're authorities. And Christ said that he was the only authority. Okay? And by the way, heaven and earth. All right? So in the beginning of Galatians, we made the point that ultimately the judge of what truth is and truth isn't is you. Because you're the one that gives an account and no one else. All right? So Paul's whole point to the recollection is to demonstrate that the gospel was from God, not men. If you read the account in Acts 9, not only, and we're going to speak shortly here before I move on, to the fact that really it is a truth and it is a fact that ecclesia history is not church history. Okay? These are, in fact, two separate histories. And I'm not going to get into it, but really the only ecclesia history that we have is the book of Acts and the gospel. Past that, the fellowship of God, the ecclesia of God's pretty much historically totally under the radar. Okay? Totally under the radar. It's more a grassroots movement, and of course was completely hijacked by the institutional church. Okay? You know, you heard often way back when in the church about how can we return to the first century like church? How can we do it? Okay, and it's really not that hard. First, you quit doing church, because the first century church wasn't church to begin with. Okay? It was not an institution, it was a literal family, and still is. All right?
Well, Paul, can I say something?
Yeah.
You were talking about like the old, the first church, and they, some people, to me, my opinion, people think that to be a congregation, you had to be into one certain assembly or building.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't in the beginning, like back in the Bible, where they didn't congregate into one building, it was in the homes?
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah.
it wasn't just like a big congregation, it was like little
Family
groups.
Mhm.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
That's why I always say, because it's not where you're fellowshipping and worshiping, it's just as long as God is there
Right.
and where your mind is in your heart.
And even though we're not going to get to Galatians 2:20, the big point there is that God is in us wherever we are, and that worship is our lifestyle. Worship is what we do no matter where we're at. And the Bible makes us, if people would just read the Bible for themselves, let's look at all the ways the Bible makes this point. There's no longer the temple in Jerusalem. It's gone. It was razed by the Romans. Okay? The Holy of Holies, when Christ died on the cross, the curtain separating the worshipers, quote unquote, from the Holy of Holies was rent from the top down. Why? Because all believers now have total access to the Holy of Holies. Okay? If you do a word study of the concept of our bodies being the temple, and we're the high priests of those temples, and you do a word study, the actual word for temple there, or the concept of temple there, is the Holy of Holies. So we're not only the temple of God and where the Holy Spirit dwells, we're the Holy of Holies part of the temple. Okay? And we are the high priest, who was the only one that had access to the Holy of Holies, and we're the priests of our own temple. And therefore, our worship, our reasonable worship, is to present our members as living sacrifices, okay, to God, okay, to please God. So instead of these animals being sacrificed as a picture of the faith to come and the justification to come apart from the law, okay, now what we have in sanctification is wherever we are, our bodies are the temple. And whatever we do is worship. And our good works and our love is giving over our members, sacrificing our members in worship to God. Okay, that's the definition of worship. Okay? And even though in church you hear, the church is the people, not the building. you sit back and you watch how church functions. Okay? There's these classes of Christians. And if you're there every time the door's open, yeah, Brother Bob, he's here every time those doors are open. Okay? And clearly, even though most pastors and parishioners would deny it, okay, what is considered worship? Okay? Listen to them talk. What's worship? Worship is when you go to church on Sunday and listen to a gospel message or this, that, and the other. That's worship. Even the big signs above sanctuaries, enter to worship, okay, leave to serve, okay? And that, of course, I'm not going to get into, John Calvin's, Sabbath sanctification concepts. I'm not going to get into that rabbit track. We've already been down one already, okay? But it's the whole concept that all of your good works, listen, any good work that you do during the week is an imputation of Christ's work because you went to church on Sunday. That's the concept, okay? Under double imputation.
But that
Okay.
is not what Scripture teaches.
Not at all.
I even wrote it down again. I've written it down several times as I've listened over the years to you, that worship is our lifestyle.
Worship is our lives. Now,
When we wake up in the morning
mm-hmm.
and throughout the whole day, and when we go to bed, our minds, our actions, our attitudes, everything we do in work, in play, in rest, is to reflect a worshipful lifestyle.
Right, so when we wake up in the morning, the first thoughts we think are either worship or they're not worship. It's either love or it's not love. Now here's the problem people get into, and what I harp a lot on under law thinking, and this all is way off script, but this is why I really prefer home fellowships, okay, because a lot of times, even though you get off script, the conversation and the thoughts and the questions are important, okay? They're very important, okay? And so when you wake up in the morning, your first thoughts are either love or not love, and it's either worship or not worship. But if you're under law, you're like, you get into this self-condemnation, okay, which empowers sin, okay? Guilt empowers sin, okay? I don't understand it, but the Bible is clear. The law's ability to condemn is what empowers sin. When the law comes along and says, don't do that, sin has a way to creating desires within you, okay, to tempt you to do that, okay? So like, sin hangs out and waits around, and when some new law comes about, all right, sin somehow, if you're under sin and under the law, sin somehow is able to use that condemnation and fear of judgment to create desires in you to actually do that. Okay? That's what the Bible says. All right? Have I seen this in real life? Yeah, I have. I worked for a nursing facility that was super, 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 super big on teamwork. They preached and emphasized teamwork all the time. Worst place for teamwork than I've ever worked in my whole life. Now, do I think the emphasis of that is law for that network actually tempted people to do the contrary? Yeah, I think that's the dynamic that was going on. I mean, the place was the absolute antithesis of teamwork. If you believed in teamwork, you were some kind of religious zealot that needed to be hung from the lamppost up front. Okay? So that's the dynamic that's at work there. So Christ comes along, dies on the cross to end the law. So there's this aspect when, as believers, there's no law to condemn us. And this is big on Galatians 2:20 here. Okay, we're going to get into the crux of that next Sunday. How that Christ dies to end the law, and the baptism of the Holy Spirit is the death of the old us that died with Christ. And this is Paul's getting into the book of Galatians here. We touched on the fact that he does a historical argument, right? Now his first argument past that is totally new birth, okay? And to argue against this justification by the law, okay? Which is not really an attempt to keep the law in order to please God, all right? So it's not that at all. So Christ comes along, he ends the law because the old us that was under the law and its condemnation dies with Christ and is literally resurrected with Christ, Romans 6, okay? And so like, even if somebody dug up the old us and drug our body into court, the judge in the courtroom has no law. Says, get a stinking corpse out of here. First of all, you can't indict a dead person. All right? We have no... Guess what? If you're on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and you die, all bets are off. Okay? There's not a thing the law can do to you. All right? So even if they drug the old you into court, the judge says, get the corpse out of here. You can't indict a dead person, A, and B, I don't have any law to indict them with anyway.
What law are you going to use to judge?
Right. So, on the other hand, though, because of the new birth and our attitude of love, okay, now the flip side of that, the law is now our manual to love God and others. So being under grace, as opposed to being under law, doesn't mean that we're not under a law. It just means now the law can no longer condemn us, but it is our guide and our discipleship manual for loving God and others. And by the way, this has never been any different. What did Moses tell people to do in Deuteronomy? Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and mind. It's never been any different. Okay? And we feel bad when we fall short of love, but we're not condemned. All right? So basically now you've got this changed heart that, now look, if your attitude is, I'm not under any law, I can live any way I want to. That is not indicative of a changed heart. Because one of the aspects of being born again is you love God's truth and you love the law of God. Now, what book in the Bible goes into that, and that book is all about that? What book is it? It's too obvious. I like to ask questions that are too obvious. Because a lot of times when we get into a book, we don't stop and think, or letter, Old Testament, you are talking books. New Testament, you're talking letters. So when we get into these Old Testament books or New Testament letters, we don't stop and think, okay, why was this written? All right? So why was Psalms written? It's all about loving God's truth and loving God's word. Look how it starts out. Blessed are those, I forget the exact words, but it's awesome. And basically, the book of Psalms starts out this way. There's only two ways and two truths in lives. God's way and the counsel of the wicked.
Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, who stands in the way of sinners, who sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord.
Right, right. For the use of God's law lawfully, as Paul put it. Well, how do you use God's law lawfully? For love. Not so that you're not condemned, but for love. It's a forward, positive outlook. Okay? So really, better stated, when we fail to keep God's law perfectly as believers, it's really a failure of love. But it's not breaking God's law, because that has to do with condemnation. So as Christians, if we got our head on right, our goal is not to break God's law. Our goal is to love. Okay? Because you can't fail to love when you're loving anyway. When you're in the process of loving, you're not sinning. Okay? Now, John Calvin and Martin Luther, that's not what they taught. And if you don't believe that, read Calvin's 10th section of book 3, the 14th chapter. Okay? That's an articulation of Martin Luther's view of the law. Okay? You can't keep it. All right? For Martin Luther, if you believe as an individual that you can do a good work pleasing to God, you're going to hell. That's a false gospel. Okay? The theology and soteriology of Martin Luther and Augustine and John Calvin, the big three of church, okay? And that's a good way of putting it. Augustine, Luther, and Calvin are absolutely the big three of church. They are the trinity of the church, Catholic or Protestant. Catholicism and Protestantism both claim Augustine as their doctor of grace. Luther and Calvin got all of their theology and soteriology from Augustine, period, and Calvin and Luther both totally make that point over and over and over and over again, okay, in all of their teachings, okay? So,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
For those children who are listening, and it's very possible that there are some listening, I was talking to our grandson and trying to explain to him about failing to love. And I used the example of, because he had just told me a lie. And he admitted it and said he was sorry and all this. And I said, you know, that lie was a failure to love.
Right.
And I went on to say, number one, you fail to love God because he encourages us in his word not to lie. you failed to love me because you lied to me to
Right.
try to get out of trouble.
Right.
And then you failed to love yourself because
Mm-hmm.
that lie broke fellowship between you and God and him and me. And his eyes got really big, like little light bulb going on. Oh, it's more than just not telling the truth to get out of trouble. Is I wasn't loving, and he said this, I wasn't loving God or grandma or myself.
Right. And with children and like adults, and the emphasis needs to be not necessarily what breaks God's law. Okay, that's against the law. Okay, but what's love and what's not love. Okay, I don't want you to stop living a decadent sexual lifestyle because it's against God's law. I want you to stop doing it because it's not love and it's not good for you or the ones you're involved in. Okay? That's why I want you to stop doing it. Okay? Not because it's against God's law. You need to get saved and not be under the law, period. Okay? I don't drive the speed limit. I don't drive the speed limit because it's against the law to do otherwise. I drive the speed limit because it endangers my own life and the life of others. Okay? So basically, you made the point of that, and when you tell a kid, hey, and using Blaine as an example, and I told Blaine, hey, why'd you lie? First of all, lying just is stupid. Because most of the time people know you're lying. You're not pulling the wool over anybody's eyes. Okay? Secondly, it's not good for you. Or firstly, it's a waste of time. Secondly, it's not good for you. Thirdly, you got to tell lies to cover for the first lies, and it's just a downward spiral. Okay? Fourthly, it makes you feel guilty. Okay? And then you can get into how, look, in your life, you've got good desires and bad desires. And holy cow, God forbid we would teach kids that they have good desires and sinful desires. Okay? But see, the fact that you're under law and under the condemnation of the law, sin is able to conjure up all kinds of. And if you think about the garden, okay, if you think about the garden, first and foremost, the serpent's goal was to create a desire in Eve, right? Okay? And it worked. Eventually she saw that the fruit was pleasant to the eyes and desirous for knowledge, this, that, and the other. The only thing is, Adam and Eve didn't know any concept of sin, and she didn't know that it was a sinful desire. Now, when you're under law, those desires are because of condemnation. And you got to explain why 1 Corinthians chapter 15 says the power of sin is the law. Now explain that one to me. The power of sin is the law. Because the condemnation of the law empowers sin. That's why. You take away the condemnation, okay, and sin is still able to make a case, okay, for desires and the fact that you're enslaved to sinful desires, but you don't have to believe that. Okay? Sin still makes a case with sinful desires, but as a born-again person who's dead to the law, the knowledge you need to have is that since condemnation is gone from the law, sin no longer has the power to actually enslave you. Okay? And how that works, even for a believer, when you say yes to a sinful desire in your thinking or whatever, you are empower it because through practice that desire becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. And this is the crux of what we call addictions. Okay? Somebody gets a sinful desire. The Christian says, that's a sinful desire that no longer has the power to enslave me. I say no. And see, this is in fact what Paul says in describing the believer. You know, one of the lifestyles of the believer that Paul's identifies is saying no to sin. Okay? Or sinful desires. As Christians, we know that we can say no to that desire. Okay? And the desires that come into our life are much weaker. Okay? And of course, everybody's got bigger struggles and is stronger in some areas than others and all this, that, and the other. An unbeliever gets this sinful desire. And they have no knowledge to deal with this sinful desire whatsoever. Okay? And actually, they have all kinds of errant beliefs about that desire. That it's who they are, okay? That they have to obey it, and then they start obeying it, and the desire intensifies to the point to where they can no longer say no to it. Okay? Unbelievers will say yes to sinful desires when it's a foregone conclusion that that desire is going to lead to their death. Okay? And I think in the Old Testament of the example of the guy who raped Tamar, who was Absalom, right? Absalom's sister. That was going to be certain death. So what's Absalom do? If I remember right, he acts like he forgave the guy or something and invites him to some. So anyway, the guy just couldn't say no. In fact, when Tamar would have no part of the guy, the fact that he was being withheld from his desire, it made him sick, right? It made him physically sick. Okay? He was physically sick because he couldn't fulfill that desire. And then, like sinful desires, when the sinful desire is fulfilled, turns to hate. Yeah. And so, you talk to all kinds of people that hate what they do, but they can't say no to it, right? Don't you hear that all the time? Right? Okay? So, the Bible explicitly, if that's the right word, gets in and explains all of the dynamics of this. How much time do we have left?
What time is it?
5 till
5 till 12?
5 till 12? Okay. And so, at any rate, now, think about this. Okay? We have this orthodoxy. And I'm going to close with this. And then we'll continue on our discussion next week. And we got down some rabbit tracks, but they're good rabbit
They're
tracks.
good ones, yes.
Okay? And so think about this. We've got this orthodoxy called church that goes like this. You can't fulfill the law because the standard for justification is perfect law keeping, because in reality you're under law. Okay? Under grace is an atonement for remaining under law. That's church. Okay? Grace is a covering, all right, that you obtain through sacraments for remaining under law and remaining yet under condemnation. Okay? So you're under law. Clearly, you're still under law, because in church orthodoxy, perfect law keeping is the standard of justification. Whereas that's not the truth. The standard for justification is the new birth, the fact that you're born anew of God and actually have the life of God inside of you. You're actually one with God. That's what justifies you. Past that, you sin, quote unquote, fail to love because you're still mortal and you're weak. Now, weakness is not sin. Okay? We've been taught through this orthodoxy that weakness is synonymous with sin. But we don't think that through. Okay? It's our motives of loving God that saves us. We fail to love God and others perfectly because we're weak. But we can still be holy and weak. Example. The angels are called in the Bible the holy angels, right? Right? Well, are they weaker than God? Sure they are. When Christ was on earth, was he holy? Absolutely. It'd be blasphemy to say otherwise. However, when he was on earth as a man, 100% man and 100% God, was he in a weaker state than what he was when he was in heaven? Of course he was. But was he still holy? You bet he was. Okay? So, we've got this orthodoxy that says you're still under the condemnation of the law because it's the standard for justification rather than the new birth. Okay? So you've got to go to church and partake in sacraments for a covering for what they call present sin, okay? Or still being under the condemnation of the law. So, what's going to happen? Sin is going to be, it's like pouring gasoline on the fire of sin. Because you're still under law. And what are you doing 3 times a week if you're an evangelical? You're going 3 times a week to church and sitting under the law. And hopefully we're not totally out of time. Okay? It bums me out tremendously what the church has become, and if it's got me bummed, imagine what Jesus Christ must be feeling. The reason the church has become as what it has become is because it's under law, and people are going there 3 times a week to sit under the law, and it's aggravating sin. It's a holy wonder that